In the quiet town of Hawkins, Indiana, something sinister lurks behind chain-link fences and concrete walls. A place where children disappear into darkness, where psychic abilities are cultivated like crops in a field, where the impossible becomes reality through the most horrifying means imaginable. Hawkins National Laboratory stands as a monument to governmental overreach, scientific hubris, and the dangerous marriage of national security with moral abandonment. But here's the unsettling truth that keeps many awake at night. Hawkins Lab isn't just the fevered imagination of television writers. The experiments, the psychological manipulation, the exploitation of vulnerable subjects in the name of Cold War supremacy, all of this has roots that burrow deep into actual history. Real laboratories, real victims, real government programs that operated in shadows for decades, their existence denied until the evidence became impossible to ignore. Welcome to the true story behind the fiction. A journey into the classified world where science abandoned ethics, where national security became a blanket excuse for unconscionable acts, and where human beings became nothing more than test subjects in experiments that would make even the most hardened conspiracy theorist shudder. This is the story of Project MKUltra, sensory deprivation torture, psychic espionage programs, and the countless lives destroyed in pursuit of the ultimate weapon, the human mind itself. The Cold War crucible. Fear as justification. To understand how respected institutions and brilliant scientists could commit such violations, we must first understand the world they inhabited. The year is 1950. The Second World War has ended, but peace proves ephemeral at best. A new conflict emerges, one fought not with conventional armies on defined battlefields, but through espionage, propaganda, proxy wars, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. The Soviet Union and the United States face each other across an ideological chasm, each convinced of the other's malevolent intentions. This wasn't merely political posturing or strategic manoeuvring. The fear permeating American society during this era was visceral and all-consuming. Citizens built fallout shelters in their backyards. School children practiced duck-and-cover drills, as if hiding under a wooden desk might somehow protect them from thermonuclear fire. The threat of communist infiltration seemed to lurk around every corner, in every neighbourhood, within every institution. And then came Korea. American soldiers, captured by North Korean and Chinese forces, began appearing in propaganda films, making startling confessions. These weren't coerced statements delivered under obvious duress. No, these men spoke calmly, articulately, denouncing capitalism and praising communism with an eerie conviction that suggested something far more sinister than simple torture or threats. They seemed reprogrammed, their personalities altered, their fundamental beliefs reversed. The term brainwashing entered the American lexicon, a literal translation of the Chinese xinao, meaning to wash the brain. Journalist Edward Hunter, who was secretly working as a CIA propagandist, popularized the concept in his sensational book. Whether or not the Soviets and Chinese actually possessed such capabilities became almost irrelevant. The perception alone was enough. American intelligence agencies became convinced that communist forces had discovered techniques for controlling human consciousness, for erasing individual will and implanting new thoughts, new loyalties, new identities. This fear catalyzed a response that would define decades of covert operations. If the enemy possessed mind control capabilities, America needed them too. If foreign agents could erase memories and reprogram human behavior, American scientists had to master the same dark arts. The stakes couldn't be higher. The very survival of Western civilization, they believed, hung in the balance, And so, with minimal oversight and maximum secrecy, the United States government embarked on a journey into the darkest corners of human experimentation. Ethics became a luxury the nation supposedly couldn't afford. Informed consent became an obstacle to national security. The Nuremberg Code, established just years earlier to prevent the horrors of Nazi medical experimentation from ever happening again, was conveniently forgotten. Allen Dulles, who had become one of the CIA's most influential directors, gave a speech in 1953 that perfectly encapsulated this mindset. He spoke of Soviet brain perversion techniques and warned that America faced an enemy who had mastered the manipulation of human consciousness. We might call it, in its new form, brain warfare, he declared ominously. He acknowledged that such techniques were abhorrent and nefarious, fundamentally opposed to American values and human dignity itself. Yet, shortly after delivering this high-minded speech, condemning Soviet tactics, Dulles approved the launch of Project MKUltra. The program would become one of the most extensive and disturbing government research initiatives in American history, involving experiments that make his warnings about Soviet abhorrence seem almost laughable in their hypocrisy. The enemy's methods were unconscionable, he insisted, even as he authorized practices on American citizens that were equally troubling. The rationalization was simple, if morally bankrupt. We're the good guys, so whatever we do in pursuit of victory is justified. The end justifies the means. National security trumps individual rights. These dangerous ideas would guide American intelligence operations for the next 2 decades, leaving a trail of shattered lives and psychological devastation in their wake. Project MKUltra, the search for mind control. In April of 1953, Project MKUltra officially began its dark journey. The program's name derived from the CIA's Technical Services Staff designation, with Ultra borrowed from the World War II classification for the most secret documents. What followed was an expansive network of clandestine experiments spanning over 150 sub-projects conducted at more than 80 institutions across North America. The man selected to lead this unprecedented venture into the manipulation of human consciousness was Sidney Gottlieb, a brilliant but morally compromised chemist who walked with a clubfoot and spoke with a stutter, yet danced with unexpected grace. Colleagues would later describe him with a mixture of awe and horror, a scientist so dedicated to his craft that ethical considerations seemed to simply not register in his decision-making process. Gottlieb's vision for MKUltra was comprehensive and chilling. The program would explore every conceivable avenue for controlling human behavior, erasing memories and implanting new thoughts. LSD became the centerpiece of this research, but the experiments ranged far beyond psychedelics. Electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, paralytic drugs, radiation, sexual abuse, verbal humiliation, anything that might break down a person's existing personality to make room for a new one. The scale of MKUltra staggers the imagination. The CIA spent an estimated $10 million on the program, equivalent to roughly $87 million in today's currency. But the true cost cannot be measured in dollars. The human toll remains impossible to fully calculate, as most records were deliberately destroyed before investigators could piece together the complete picture. In the early 1950s, Gottlieb arranged for the CIA to purchase LSD from the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz. The agency spent $240,000 to secure what they believed was the complete available supply, though it turned out to be approximately 40,000 doses rather than the massive stockpile they'd anticipated. Still, the CIA wanted to ensure that if anyone was going to experiment with this powerful psychoactive compound, it would be American researchers, not Soviet scientists. They distributed this LSD far and wide, funneling it to researchers at universities, hospitals and prisons through bogus front organisations. Many researchers had no idea their grants came from the CIA. They believed they were conducting legitimate academic research into the therapeutic potential of psychedelics or the nature of human consciousness. The extent to which the CIA deliberately obscured its involvement versus researchers simply not asking questions about their funding sources varied from case to case, but the result was the same: unwitting participation in an intelligence operation seeking weapons for psychological warfare. The test subjects came from the most vulnerable segments of society, mental patients who couldn't consent to anything, let alone dangerous drug experiments. Prisoners who were offered reduced sentences or small rewards in exchange for their participation. Drug addicts promised more heroin if they'd volunteer for LSD trials. College students looking to make extra money or contribute to science. Prostitutes recruited to dose unsuspecting Johns with acid while CIA agents watched through two-way mirrors. Many subjects had no idea they were part of any experiment at all. They were simply drugged without their knowledge or consent, then observed as the psychedelic effects took hold. The results were often catastrophic. Consider the case documented at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky. Dr. Harris Isbell, the facility's director, conducted experiments that read like something from a nightmare. 7 men, nearly all African American prisoners, were given LSD every single day for 77 consecutive days. 77 days of continuous psychedelic experience, of reality constantly shifting and distorting, of boundaries between self and environment dissolving again and again. The goal was to understand tolerance. Could a person develop resistance to LSD's effects? This question mattered to the CIA because they feared Soviet agents might dose captured American soldiers, then interrogate them while their minds were fractured and vulnerable. If American personnel could develop a tolerance, they might resist such tactics. But the human cost of answering this question was never seriously considered. These prisoners at Lexington had committed themselves to the facility to overcome heroin addiction. Dr. Isbell exploited their desperation, offering them the very drug they were trying to escape in exchange for submitting to his experiments. The facility developed a 90% return rate, as local drug users learned they could reliably get their fix by volunteering for Isbell's trials. It became an open secret, a hellish bargain struck between desperate addicts and a government scientist with unlimited resources and no meaningful oversight. Boston crime boss Whitey Bulger, who participated in MKUltra experiments while imprisoned in the 1950s, later described his experience in harrowing terms. In written accounts of his time at Atlanta Penitentiary, he recalled 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state, total loss of appetite, hallucinating. The room would change shape, hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even blood coming out of the walls. Guys turning into skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane. Bulger was told he was participating in research to find a cure for schizophrenia. Only years later did he learn the truth. He had been a guinea pig in a government experiment designed to see if prolonged LSD exposure could destroy a person's mind entirely, creating a blank slate upon which new thoughts and loyalties might be written. In later reflections, Bulger put it bluntly, "I was in prison for committing a crime, but they committed a greater crime on me." The experiments weren't limited to criminals and addicts. At universities across America, students volunteered for what they believed were legitimate psychological studies. At Stanford, a young creative writing student named Ken Kesey participated in LSD trials at the VA hospital where he worked as a night aide. The experience profoundly affected him, inspiring his novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and launching him on a psychedelic journey that would help define the counterculture movement of the 1960s. Robert Hunter, who would become the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, received his first LSD through CIA-funded research. Allen Ginsberg, the beat poet who would preach the gospel of psychedelic exploration to a generation, got his initial doses from an MKUltra funded study. Ted Kaczynski, who would later become known as the Unabomber, participated in stressful psychological experiments at Harvard during the same period, though whether these experiments were directly connected to MKUltra remains a matter of scholarly debate. The supreme irony of the program cannot be overstated. The CIA hoped LSD would become their key to controlling human consciousness, a tool for breaking enemy agents and programming American operatives. Instead, the drug they spread so widely sparked a generational rebellion dedicated to rejecting everything the CIA stood for. The mind control weapon backfired spectacularly, fueling a counterculture movement that questioned authority, opposed the Vietnam War, and embraced expanded consciousness as a path to human liberation. But not everyone who encountered CIA-distributed LSD did so voluntarily. Operation Midnight Climax represented perhaps the most cynical and disturbing sub-project within MKUltra's vast network. Federal agent George Hunter White, a former Office of Strategic Services operative who reportedly killed a Chinese spy with his bare hands, ran this operation with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his perfect vocation. White set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, disguising them as brothels. CIA-employed prostitutes would lure unsuspecting men to these locations, then slip LSD into their drinks without their knowledge, while the drugged men experienced the bewildering effects of a powerful psychedelic in an unfamiliar setting. White and his colleagues watched from behind two-way mirrors, drinking cocktails and taking notes. Recording devices were installed throughout the rooms, cunningly disguised as electrical outlets. The CIA filmed these sessions for later analysis, capturing men at their most vulnerable and disoriented. The official justification was that they needed to understand how subjects behaved under the influence of psychedelics in realistic scenarios. The reality was darker. They wanted to see if drugged individuals would reveal secrets, if the combination of LSD and sexual activity might make someone more suggestible, more malleable. White wrote to Gottlieb about his work with undisguised glee. "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun." The casual cruelty in those words captures the moral vacuum at the heart of MKUltra. These weren't reluctant scientists performing distasteful but necessary research for national security. They were enthusiasts, people who relished the power to secretly dose strangers with reality-altering substances and watch the chaos unfold. The atmosphere surrounding these experiments was described as freewheeling and party-like. Proper scientific protocols were ignored. Ethical guidelines were non-existent. The experiments told the researchers little of practical value about mind control, but they continued for years because those involved enjoyed the work too much to stop. And then there was the tragic case of Frank Olson. A biochemist working for the Army's Special Operations Division, Olson attended a retreat at a remote Maryland cabin in November of 1953. During the gathering, Sidney Gottlieb spiked the after-dinner drinks with LSD, dosing Olson and several other scientists without warning them. This was presented as an experiment in administering drugs to unwitting subjects, exactly the kind of scenario they were supposedly preparing to defend against. Olson had a severe reaction. He became agitated, paranoid, convinced that his colleagues were plotting against him. The psychedelic experience appeared to trigger, or amplify existing anxieties about the work he was doing, the moral implications of developing biological weapons, and participating in mind control research. 10 days after being dosed, Frank Olson fell to his death from a New York hotel window. The official ruling was suicide. Olson's family was told he had suffered a mental breakdown. They received a government apology and financial compensation decades later, but questions about his death persist. Some researchers and family members believe Olson was murdered because he planned to leave the program and might have revealed its secrets. Whether his death was suicide triggered by the LSD experience or something more sinister remains a matter of debate, but either way, Frank Olson's death stands as a stark reminder of MKUltra's human cost. By the early 1960s, even MKUltra's architects had to admit failure. The goal of reliable mind control proved elusive. LSD and other psychedelics were too unpredictable, producing wildly different effects in different individuals. You couldn't use them to extract reliable information from enemy agents. You couldn't program someone to become an unwitting assassin, like the character in The Manchurian Candidate. The drugs were simply too chaotic, too dependent on set and setting, too influenced by individual psychology to serve as precision tools for behavioural modification. But Sidney Gottlieb didn't stop his work. He simply shifted focus to developing poisons and high-tech gadgets for CIA operatives to use in the field. The mind control dream died, but the willingness to experiment on unwitting human subjects for perceived national security benefits remained alive and well within American intelligence agencies. Sensory deprivation, breaking down reality. While LSD research captured headlines once MKUltra became public, another line of experimentation proved equally disturbing and, in some ways, more successful at achieving its goals. Sensory deprivation research explored what happens to human consciousness when cut off from external stimuli, and the results suggested terrifying possibilities for controlling and manipulating vulnerable minds. The research began at McGill University in Montreal during the early 1950s. Donald Hebb, chair of the psychology department and a pioneering figure in neuroscience, designed experiments to test what would happen if human subjects were isolated from normal sensory input for extended periods. His stated justification focused on understanding how monotonous environments affected performance, ostensibly relevant for understanding the experiences of radar operators stationed in remote Arctic outposts during the Cold War. However, Hebb's funding came from the Canadian Defence Research Board, which maintained close ties with the CIA. Evidence suggests the true motivation involved understanding whether sensory deprivation might make people more suggestible, more vulnerable to interrogation, more likely to accept new ideas, and abandon old beliefs. The Korean War POW confessions had raised questions about what role isolation might play in the techniques communist forces were reportedly using on captured Americans. Hebb's experimental setup sounds almost quaint compared to what would come later, but the effects on subjects proved dramatic. College students were recruited and paid to spend time in a small room. They wore translucent goggles that admitted light but prevented them from seeing shapes or patterns. Cotton gloves and cardboard tubes covered their hands and arms, minimizing the sense of touch. They lay on comfortable cots, but U-shaped foam pillows surrounded their heads, and the continuous hum of an air conditioner masked most sounds. The subjects could leave at any time. They were fed regularly and could use the bathroom when needed, but most couldn't last more than 2 or 3 days, and nobody made it to the planned 6-week duration. Something about the absence of varied sensory input proved psychologically unbearable. The effects began subtly. Subjects initially slept for long hours, catching up on rest, but as time passed, they grew increasingly restless, bored, irritable. Their ability to think clearly deteriorated. Simple problem-solving tasks became impossibly difficult. They couldn't concentrate or maintain a coherent train of thought. More disturbingly, many subjects began experiencing hallucinations. They saw geometric patterns dancing across their vision, colours and shapes that weren't there. Some reported more complex hallucinations, entire scenes playing out before them. Rows of marching figures. Processions of eyeglasses moving across the wall. Prehistoric animals wandering through the unwitting room. The subjects knew these visions weren't real, but they couldn't make them stop. The researchers then introduced what they called propaganda records, audio recordings making claims about paranormal phenomena, ESP, and other fringe topics. They wanted to see if the disoriented, stimulus-hungry subjects would be more receptive to outlandish ideas than they would be under normal circumstances. The results suggested they were. Several subjects later went to the library seeking books about psychic phenomena, their critical thinking apparently compromised by the isolation experience. These findings had obvious implications for interrogation. If you could isolate prisoners from normal sensory input, make them desperate for any form of stimulation, you might be able to feed them ideas and information they would normally reject. You might be able to break down their existing worldview and replace it with something new. John C. Lilly, a brilliant and eccentric neurophysiologist working at the National Institute of Mental Health, took sensory deprivation research in a different direction. Lilly wanted to study consciousness itself, to understand what happened to the human mind when freed from the constant processing of external sensory data. His approach was more extreme than Hebb's. In 1954, Lilly developed the first isolation tank. Early versions involved complete submersion in water, with subjects wearing breathing apparatus similar to scuba gear and blackout masks to eliminate all visual input. The water was heated to skin temperature, eliminating the sensory distinction between body and environment. Sound was muffled by the water and by the enclosed tank design. The experience was initially terrifying for most subjects. The complete absence of sensory input, the inability to even feel where your body ended and the environment began, triggered intense anxiety. But Lilly refined his design, allowing subjects to float face up in a saturated solution of Epsom salts, which provided natural buoyancy. This made the experience less claustrophobic and anxiety-inducing. Lilly's research revealed something remarkable. When isolated from external sensory input, the human brain doesn't simply go quiet. Instead, it begins generating its own content, creating an internal reality to fill the void. Subjects reported out-of-body experiences, encounters with entities, journeys through strange inner landscapes. Some found the experience profoundly meditative and therapeutic. Others found it disturbing or even terrifying. The implications for the intelligence community were obvious. In classified papers written in the late 1950s, Lilly described how sensory isolation, combined with electrical brain stimulation and other techniques, could potentially be used to gain control over human behavior. He wrote about the possibility of master-slave controls directly of one brain over another, language that sounds more like science fiction than scientific research, but was taken seriously by his military and intelligence funders. Lilly's vision was dystopian, a world where those in power could use technology to directly manipulate the thoughts and behaviours of others, creating perfectly obedient subjects. His papers were classified and would remain hidden for decades, but his research established the foundation for what would become standard interrogation techniques used by American intelligence agencies. The dark applications of sensory deprivation research became apparent in the CIA's QBARC interrogation manual, compiled in the early 1960s. QBARC, the CIA's cryptonym for itself, drew heavily on the sensory deprivation research conducted at McGill and elsewhere. The manual explicitly recommended using isolation, darkness, and sensory monotony to break down prisoners' psychological resistance. The chief effect of sensory deprivation, the manual explained, is to bring about a degradation of normal psychological functioning. Isolated prisoners become disoriented, their sense of time distorts. They become increasingly susceptible to suggestion. The manual noted that this wasn't torture in the traditional sense, no physical pain or injury, but the psychological impact could be devastating. This no-touch torture paradigm would define American interrogation techniques for decades. The famous image from Abu Ghraib prison showing a hooded detainee standing on a box with wires attached to his hands has been analysed by researchers as emblematic of interrogation techniques with historical roots. The hood creates sensory deprivation. The stress position, with arms extended, creates physical discomfort. These methods reflect principles documented in earlier interrogation manuals about psychological pressure without leaving visible marks. Researchers and historians have traced connections from Hebb's experiments at McGill through the QBARC manual to updated training materials used in Honduras in the 1980s, and eventually to interrogation protocols used in Iraq and Afghanistan. While the direct lines of influence are sometimes debated, the conceptual continuity suggests that research initially justified as understanding monotony for Arctic radar operators found its way into interrogation practices deployed on a global scale. But sensory deprivation also had a strange second life. As Lilly continued his research, he moved away from the military applications that had initially funded his work. He began using the isolation tank on himself, combining it with psychedelic drugs to explore consciousness and the nature of reality. He became a countercultural figure, advocating for the therapeutic and consciousness-expanding potential of sensory deprivation. By the 1970s, flotation tanks began appearing in cities around the world as a form of alternative therapy. The same technique used by intelligence agencies to break down prisoners' psychological defences was now marketed as a path to deep relaxation, meditation, and self-discovery. Today, you can book a session at a float spa in most major cities, lying in darkness and silence for an hour or two, supposedly reducing stress and anxiety. The transformation from torture device to wellness trend highlights the dual nature of these technologies. Sensory deprivation isn't inherently good or bad. It's a tool whose effects depend entirely on context and consent. Used voluntarily for limited periods in a safe setting, it can indeed be therapeutic. Used as part of prolonged interrogation on prisoners with no choice in the matter, it becomes psychological torture. But this transformation also serves to obscure the technique's dark history. When someone climbs into a flotation tank at a trendy spa, they probably aren't thinking about CIA black sites or the Montreal experiments or the prisoners at Abu Ghraib. The technique has been sanitized, disconnected from its origins in the Cold War quest for mind control. And perhaps that's exactly how those who developed these methods would prefer it to be remembered. The Montreal experiments, Cameron's Chamber of Horrors. If MKUltra represents American intelligence's descent into unethical experimentation, the Montreal experiments stand as perhaps the program's darkest sub-project. What happened at the Allen Memorial Institute between 1957 and 1964 goes beyond uncomfortable ethical compromises made in the name of national security. It was systematic torture disguised as psychiatric treatment, carried out by a respected psychiatrist who genuinely believed he was helping his patients. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron was not some mad scientist working in a secret government laboratory. He was president of the American Psychiatric Association, president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and in 1961 became president of the World Psychiatric Association. He was establishment psychiatry personified, a man whose colleagues viewed him as a leader in the field. Cameron developed a theory he called psychic driving. He believed that many psychiatric conditions resulted from faulty patterns of thought that had become fixed in patients' minds. If you could erase these problematic patterns, he theorized, you could then rebuild the person's psyche in a healthier configuration. Whether Cameron genuinely believed this approach would help his patients, or whether he was primarily motivated by the CIA funding and the opportunity to conduct unprecedented experiments, remains unclear. What's certain is that his theory became the justification for brutal procedures. The CIA found Cameron's ideas fascinating. If you could erase someone's existing thoughts and memories, you might be able to implant new ones. You might be able to take an enemy agent and turn them into an ally. You might be able to program an American operative to carry out missions with no memory of their briefing, creating a real-life version of the Manchurian Candidate scenario that obsessed Cold War planners. Through a CIA front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, Cameron received $69,000 between 1957 and 1964 to carry out his experiments. The Canadian government also provided substantial funding, with Cameron receiving more than $500,000 from federal sources between 1950 and 1965. His work became MKUltra Project 68. Cameron's methods were brutally simple in concept, horrifying in execution. The first phase, which he called de-patterning, aimed to break down the patient's existing personality structure completely. To achieve this, he subjected patients to what he termed intensive electroconvulsive therapy. But this bore little resemblance to the carefully controlled ECT procedures used in modern psychiatry. Patients were placed into drug-induced comas lasting days or weeks, sometimes as long as 88 consecutive days. While unconscious, they received electroshock, treatments multiple times daily, far exceeding the intensity and frequency considered safe even by the standards of that era. Some patients received up to 360 shocks over the course of their treatment. The goal was to reduce patients to what Cameron called an infantile state. He wanted to erase their memories, their personalities, their very sense of self. And his methods were terrifyingly effective at achieving this destruction, even if the subsequent reconstruction he promised never materialized. While patients were in this broken state, Cameron implemented the second phase, psychic driving. He recorded statements and played them on endless loops through speakers installed in helmets that patients were forced to wear. The helmets also included blackout goggles for sensory deprivation. Patients might hear the same message repeated thousands of times. You are a good wife and mother. People enjoy your company. Or accusations and condemnations, depending on what Cameron believed would reshape their psyche most effectively. He also administered massive doses of LSD and other drugs, including curare, a paralytic that left patients conscious but unable to move or communicate. The combination of drugs, electroshock, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation created a nightmare that patients couldn't wake from, couldn't escape, couldn't even fully comprehend while it was happening. The subjects of these experiments were not criminals or enemy agents. They were psychiatric patients, people suffering from depression, anxiety, postpartum difficulties, or other conditions who came to Cameron seeking help. They had no idea they were part of a CIA-funded experiment. They certainly never consented to the brutality inflicted upon them. The results were catastrophic. When patients finally left Cameron's care, many had no memory of who they were, where they came from, or what their life had been before treatment. They couldn't recognise family members. They had lost motor skills, had to be toilet trained again, had to relearn how to eat and dress themselves. They were like children in adult bodies, their previous personalities completely erased. One patient, the wife of a Canadian Member of Parliament, entered the Allen Memorial Institute for treatment of mild postpartum depression. When she emerged months later, she had no memory of her husband or children. She couldn't remember her own name. The confident, capable woman who had entered seeking help for a transient condition left as a dependent shell of her former self. Linda MacDonald was a young mother of 5 when she sought treatment from Cameron for mild depression in 1963. She spent 6 months at the Allen Memorial Institute. When she left, she couldn't read or write, didn't recognise her children, had no memory of the first 26 years of her life. She described the experience in heartbreaking terms. I had no identity. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I looked like. I had to be toilet trained. I had to be taught to walk again. The children of Cameron's victims bore their own trauma. They watched as their mothers or fathers became strangers. Families were destroyed. Some victims could never live independently again, requiring constant care for the rest of their lives. The multi-generational impact of these experiments continues to reverberate today. It's unclear exactly how many people Cameron subjected to his experiments. Over 300 people applied for compensation from the Canadian government in 1992, but this likely represents only a fraction of the total victims. Many died before the experiments became public knowledge. Others were too damaged to navigate the compensation process. Some families, ashamed of what happened, or simply trying to move forward, chose not to come forward. Cameron himself left the project in 1964, 4 years before his contract was scheduled to end. The reasons for his early departure remain unclear. In 1967, he died of a heart attack while mountain climbing. He never faced accountability for what he did. He never apologised to his victims. As far as anyone knows, he went to his grave without publicly acknowledging the harm his experiments had caused. The Canadian government's complicity in these experiments cannot be overstated. They didn't just permit Cameron's work. They actively funded it with money from the Canadian government, in addition to the CIA funds. When the truth began emerging in the 1980s, Canadian officials initially tried to suppress the information, then downplayed the government's role, then dragged their feet on providing compensation to victims. In 1988, some victims successfully sued the CIA and received $67,000 each. In 1992, the Canadian government finally provided compensation, $100,000 to 77 victims who could prove they'd been Cameron's subjects. But no amount of money could truly compensate for stolen memories, destroyed families, and lives derailed by involuntary participation in experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. The Montreal experiments represent human experimentation at its most unconscionable. These weren't theoretical war scenarios or preparations for hypothetical future conflicts. These were real people, Canadian citizens seeking medical help, who were used as guinea pigs and permanently damaged in pursuit of mind control techniques that never worked and could never work as intended. And yet, the techniques Cameron developed didn't disappear. His methods influenced the QBARC interrogation manual. The combination of sensory deprivation, disorientation, drugs, and repetitive messaging became part of the toolkit American intelligence agencies used at black sites around the world. The specific implementation changed, but the underlying theory, that you could break down a person's existing mental structure through intense psychological pressure remained central to American interrogation practices. The Montreal experiments stand as a stark reminder of what happens when the pursuit of national security objectives combines with medical authority and operates without meaningful oversight or accountability. Cameron was a respected professional, operating at a legitimate medical institution, treating patients who came to him voluntarily, and yet he inflicted torture that would have been criminal in any other context, justified by the Cold War belief that anything done in the name of fighting communism was permissible. Project Stargate, when psychics became spies. While MKUltra explored the dark potential of drugs and psychological manipulation, another Cold War program pursued an even stranger goal, weaponizing psychic abilities for intelligence gathering. What would eventually become known as Project Stargate represented the United States government's decades-long attempt to develop and deploy extrasensory perception for espionage purposes. The program began in 1972, sparked by intelligence reports suggesting the Soviet Union was investing heavily in parapsychology research. American intelligence analysts feared a psychic gap, analogous to the missile gap that had driven the arms race. If Soviet psychics could peer into classified American facilities using only their minds, if they could predict American military movements through precognition, the consequences for national security could be catastrophic. The initial research took place at Stanford Research Institute in California, led by physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ. They focused primarily on remote viewing, the purported ability to perceive and describe distant locations, objects, or events without using normal sensory channels. The concept sounds like pure science fiction, but the researchers approached it with apparent scientific rigor, developing protocols to test whether certain individuals could reliably access information through anomalous means. One of their first test subjects was Uri Geller, the Israeli entertainer famous for his claimed ability to bend spoons with his mind. For 8 days in August of 1973, researchers at Stanford locked Geller in a sealed room and conducted various experiments to test his abilities. They asked him to identify hidden drawings, locate buried metal objects, and demonstrate psychokinetic effects. The results were mixed and controversial. Sometimes Geller seemed to perform above chance levels. Other times, his accuracy was no better than random guessing. Skeptics pointed out numerous methodological flaws in the experiments, ways that sensory leakage or subtle cues could have influenced the results. Believers countered that the positive results, however inconsistent, suggested something genuinely anomalous was occurring. Regardless of the scientific validity, the CIA found the concept appealing enough to continue funding research. By the late 1970s, the program had expanded, and in 1978 officially transferred to Fort Meade in Maryland, where it operated under Defense Intelligence Agency oversight. The goal shifted from pure research toward operational applications. Could remote viewing provide actionable intelligence? The program employed about 15 to 20 individuals at its peak, a surprisingly small number for such an ambitious undertaking. These remote viewers came from diverse backgrounds. Some were military personnel. Others were civilians claiming natural psychic abilities. The most famous was Joseph McMonigal, an Army veteran who became known as Remote Viewer Number 1. McMonigal participated in roughly 450 missions during his time with the program, spanning 1978 to 1984. His specialties included finding missing persons, locating weapons facilities, and, bizarrely, exploring near-death experiences and UFO phenomena. The work was classified at levels exceeding top secret. Security briefings occurred every 2 weeks, with personnel constantly reminded of the extraordinary sensitivity of their mission. A typical remote viewing session involved minimal information. McMonigal might receive a sealed envelope containing only geographic coordinates or a brief description of the target. He would then enter a meditative state and attempt to describe or sketch whatever impressions came to mind. The idea was that conscious reasoning interfered with psychic perception, so viewers needed to quiet their analytical minds and simply report whatever they experienced. One of the program's most celebrated successes involved a Soviet submarine. During the Cold War, American intelligence desperately sought information about new Soviet naval capabilities. McMonigal claimed he could remotely view a Soviet shipyard and describe a new class of submarine under construction. His description allegedly matched a vessel that satellite intelligence subsequently confirmed, the massive Typhoon-class submarine, the largest ever built. Whether this represents genuine psychic ability, an educated guess based on publicly available information, or access to classified briefings that McMonigal may have received but didn't consciously remember, remains debated. Proponents point to this case as proof that remote viewing provided genuine intelligence value, while skeptics note the classification makes independent verification impossible. The program also pursued stranger investigations. In 1984, researchers gave McMonigal a sealed envelope and asked him to describe whatever he perceived. The envelope, unknown to McMonigal, contained information about Mars roughly 1 million years ago. His response described very tall, thin beings in strange clothing, along with obelisks and pyramids. The interpretation of this session varies wildly depending on one's perspective. Some view it as evidence of genuine perception beyond normal sensory channels. Others suggest it represents the human mind's tendency to generate archetypal imagery when seeking patterns in ambiguous situations. The ambiguity in such results plagued the program throughout its existence. Remote viewing sessions often produced information that was vague, symbolic, or simply wrong. Even the successes were rarely specific enough to provide actionable intelligence. A remote viewer might correctly identify that a target facility was underground and near mountains, but that description could apply to dozens of locations. Follow-up was always required to verify and specify the intelligence gathered. Another remote viewer, Angela Della Fiora Ford, worked with the program for 9 years. She specialized in locating missing persons and fugitives. In one often cited case from 1989, she was asked to help track down a former customs agent who had fled justice. Ford reported seeing the name Lowell, Wyoming. US Customs arrested the fugitive 100 miles west of a Wyoming town called Lovell. The proximity of these names suggests either a near hit in terms of psychic perception, or, as skeptics argue, a fortunate guess given that fugitives commonly hide in remote locations, and Wyoming has relatively few population centers. The program operated under multiple code names over the years: Sunstreak, Center Lane, Stargate. The frequent name changes reflected organizational shuffling and attempts to maintain secrecy as rumors leaked out. Throughout the 1980s, reports of government psychic experiments surfaced in the press, but the Pentagon consistently denied spending money on parapsychology research. The end came in 1995. With the Cold War over and budget scrutiny increasing, the CIA commissioned an independent evaluation from the American Institutes for Research. The resulting report acknowledged that some laboratory experiments had shown statistically significant results, suggesting that something beyond odd statistical hiccups is taking place. But the evaluators concluded that remote viewing had never produced actionable intelligence and shouldn't be used operationally. The report noted that remote viewing information was consistently too vague and ambiguous to guide actual intelligence operations. You couldn't plan a military strike based on a psychic's symbolic impressions. You couldn't rescue hostages using vague descriptions of their location. And the accuracy was too inconsistent to be reliable. Project Stargate was terminated and declassified. The legacy of this program remains contested. True believers point to the positive results and argue that remote viewing represents a genuine human capability that deserves continued research. They note that the research was conducted by serious scientists using legitimate protocols. The statistical results, they insist, can't be explained by chance or fraud. Skeptics counter that the positive results were the product of poor experimental design, confirmation bias, and the file drawer effect, where negative results go unpublished while positive results get attention. They note that attempts to replicate the research under stricter controls have consistently failed. The lack of any theoretical mechanism for how remote viewing might work troubles scientifically minded critics. What's undeniable is that the United States government spent over $20 million and more than 2 decades investigating whether psychic phenomena could be weaponized. The very existence of the TAM program demonstrates the lengths to which Cold War paranoia drove intelligence agencies. If there was even a tiny chance that Soviet psychics could peer into American secrets, the thinking went, we had to develop our own capabilities. The program also reveals something about the permeable boundaries between mainstream science and fringe beliefs during this era. The researchers at Stanford were respected physicists. The military personnel involved were serious professionals, yet they were investigating claims that most scientists considered pseudoscience at best, fraud at worst. The Cold War created space for unconventional thinking, for exploring possibilities that would normally be dismissed out of hand. Project Stargate never achieved its stated goals. Remote viewing didn't revolutionize intelligence gathering. Psychic spies didn't render satellites and human sources obsolete. But the program's existence adds another layer to the already strange story of Cold War era experimentation. Between the drug trials, the sensory deprivation studies, and the psychic espionage program, it becomes clear that American intelligence agencies were willing to pursue virtually any avenue, no matter how unconventional, in pursuit of advantage over the Soviet Union. The counterculture connection. How government LSD created a revolution. One of the great ironies of MKUltra is that the CIA's experiments inadvertently seeded the very counterculture movement that would come to oppose everything the agency represented. The government wanted to use LSD as a tool for control. Instead, the drug sparked a cultural revolution dedicated to expanded consciousness, personal freedom, and resistance to authority. The connection begins with those early experiments at universities and research centres. When the CIA distributed LSD to researchers across the country, some of those researchers recruited volunteers from the surrounding community. These volunteers had life-changing experiences under the influence of the drug, then shared those experiences with friends and colleagues. The psychedelic genie escaped from the bottle almost immediately. Ken Kesey's journey exemplifies this process. A creative writing student at Stanford, Kesey volunteered for LSD experiments at the VA hospital in Menlo Park, where he worked as a night aide. The experience profoundly affected his worldview and his art. He wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest while working the night shift, influenced by both the psychiatric patients he observed and the LSD experiences that had revealed to him the arbitrary nature of social authority. But Kesey didn't stop with writing about his insights. He became an evangelist for psychedelic experience, believing that LSD offered a path to liberation from societal conditioning. With a group of followers who called themselves the Merry Pranksters. Kesey began hosting acid tests in the San Francisco Bay Area in the mid-1960s. These weren't clinical experiments or controlled research settings. They were parties, wild gatherings where attendees drank LSD-laced Kool-Aid, danced to live music by bands like the Grateful Dead, and experienced reality-shattering psychedelic journeys in rooms decorated with fluorescent paint and illuminated by black lights. The acid tests became legendary, helping to catalyse the hippie movement and the broader psychedelic culture of the late 1960s. Robert Hunter, who attended some of Kesey's early experiments and would later become the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, received his first LSD through CIA-funded research. His psychedelic experiences directly influenced the poetic, consciousness-exploring lyrics that became a hallmark of the band's work. Songs like Dark Star and Terrapin Station emerge from a worldview shaped by repeated journeys into psychedelic space, journeys that began with government-supplied acid. Allen Ginsberg, already a prominent figure in the Beat movement, participated in LSD experiments at Stanford in the late 1950s. He had multiple sessions, exploring the drug's potential for artistic inspiration and spiritual insight. Ginsberg became one of LSD's most vocal proponents, writing about his experiences and encouraging others to explore altered states of consciousness. Ginsberg saw psychedelics as a tool for breaking through the rigid thinking of American society, for transcending the materialistic Cold War mentality that he believed was leading civilization toward destruction. He connected the psychedelic experience to Eastern spiritual traditions, particularly Buddhism, creating a framework for understanding LSD as a sacrament rather than merely a drug. Even Timothy Leary, who became perhaps the single most famous advocate for psychedelic drugs, had connections to the CIA's research network. While Leary himself didn't directly receive drugs from MKUltra, he was aware of the government's interest in psychedelics and conducted his own experiments at Harvard with mushrooms and LSD. His famous injunction to turn on, tune in, drop out became a rallying cry for a generation seeking alternatives to conventional American life. The CIA's vision for LSD involved using it to break down enemy agents' psychological defenses, to make people more suggestible and controllable. What actually happened was that the drug made users question authority, challenge conventional thinking, and seek alternative ways of organizing society. The mind control weapon backfired spectacularly, creating instead a consciousness expansion movement. By the mid-1960s, LSD had become central to the youth counterculture. Rock musicians experimented with the drug and created new forms of music influenced by psychedelic experience. Artists produced works that captured the visual distortions and altered perception of the LSD state. Young people across America dropped acid at concerts, in college dorms, in communes, seeking the revelatory experiences their friends described. The anti-war movement, the civil rights struggle, the questioning of traditional gender roles and sexual mores, the environmental movement, all of these social changes had multiple causes and complex origins. The psychedelic experience likely played a role in opening some minds to alternative possibilities, though the extent of this influence remains debated by historians. When you've experienced reality as fluid and constructed, when you've seen the arbitrary nature of social conventions from a different perspective, it can become easier to question established norms. The government's response to this unintended consequence was to crack down hard. By the late 1960s, sensational news stories about LSD's dangers saturated the media. Claims about chromosome damage, birth defects, and psychotic breaks dominated headlines. In 1966, California became the first state to ban the drug. By 1968, federal law made LSD illegal nationwide. the crackdown on psychedelics went hand in hand with broader efforts to suppress the counterculture movement. Police raids on communes and concerts, surveillance of activists and musicians, prosecutions of anyone possessing or distributing LSD. The government was trying to put the genie back in the bottle to undo the cultural changes that their own experiments had helped catalyse. Timothy Leary became public enemy number one in this campaign, prosecuted repeatedly for drug violations and eventually imprisoned. President Nixon called him the most dangerous man in America, a remarkable designation for a former psychology professor whose main crime was encouraging people to expand their consciousness through drug use. But Leary represented everything the establishment feared about the counterculture: rejection of traditional values, questioning of authority, pursuit of personal transformation over material success. The supreme irony is that the CIA spent millions of dollars distributing LSD in hopes of developing mind control capabilities, only to spark a cultural movement dedicated to freeing minds from control. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who ran MKUltra and bought up the world's supply of LSD, became the unwitting godfather of the psychedelic revolution. His attempts to weaponize consciousness instead liberated it, at least in the minds of those who experienced the drug's effects. This unintended consequence reveals something fundamental about the nature of psychedelic drugs. They're too unpredictable, too dependent on set and setting, too influenced by individual psychology to serve as precision tools for behavior control. Give someone LSD intending to break them down for interrogation, and the results might be chaotic but not reliably useful. Give someone LSD in a supportive setting with a framework for understanding the experience as spiritually meaningful, and you might create a lifelong advocate for consciousness exploration. The CIA never understood this. They approached LSD as a chemical compound that would produce consistent effects, a weapon that could be aimed with precision. But consciousness doesn't work that way. The psychedelic experience is collaborative, a product of drug, individual, and environment interacting in complex ways. You can't control it any more than you can control a thunderstorm. By the early 1970s, the experiment was over. MKUltra shut down in 1973, its records deliberately destroyed. LSD was criminalized and driven underground. The brief moment when psychedelic drugs might have been integrated into mainstream culture in thoughtful ways passed. But the cultural impact remained, influencing music, art, spirituality, and social movements for decades to come. Today, we're experiencing something of a psychedelic renaissance. Researchers are once again studying LSD, psilocybin, and other psychedelics for therapeutic applications, treating depression, anxiety, PTSD, and addiction with impressive results. This time, the research is conducted ethically, with informed consent and proper oversight. The goal isn't weaponization, but healing. But this new chapter in psychedelic research exists in the shadow of MKUltra. The memory of government abuse makes many people skeptical of official involvement in psychedelics research. Proposals for medical applications of these drugs face resistance partly because of the tainted history. The CIA's experiments poisoned the well, making it harder for legitimate researchers to explore potentially valuable therapeutic applications. The counterculture connection also serves as a reminder that scientific research never exists in isolation from broader social and cultural contexts. The drugs the CIA hoped would serve as weapons of psychological warfare instead became sacraments of the peace movement. The tools of control became tools of liberation. This transformation wasn't inevitable, but it speaks to the unpredictable nature of consciousness and the impossibility of fully controlling how ideas and experiences propagate through a culture. The revelation: how the truth finally emerged. For 2 decades, Project MKUltra operated in near complete secrecy. The American public knew nothing about the CIA's vast network of drug experiments, sensory deprivation studies, and other forms of psychological research on unwitting subjects. Even Congress remained largely in the dark, with only a handful of committees receiving vague briefings that concealed more than they revealed. This secrecy wasn't accidental. The program's architects understood from the beginning that public knowledge of their activities would provoke outrage. They deliberately compartmentalized the research, funding experiments through front organizations, so that even the researchers often didn't know the CIA was behind their grants. Documents were classified at the highest levels. Personnel were regularly reminded that disclosure could result in criminal prosecution. But secrets have a way of escaping, especially secrets as large and complex as MKUltra. The program involved too many people, too many institutions, too many experiments, and some of those involved began to have doubts, questions about whether the work was justified, concerns about the human cost. The first crack in the wall of secrecy came not from a whistleblower, but from a tragedy. In July 1975, the Washington Post published an article revealing that the CIA had conducted illegal experiments on American citizens during the 1960s. The story emerged from investigations into intelligence agency abuses sparked by the Watergate scandal and the general climate of distrust toward government that characterized the mid-1970s. The revelation shocked the nation. Americans had always believed their government might conduct questionable operations against foreign adversaries, but experimenting on American citizens without their knowledge seemed to cross a fundamental line. The story prompted immediate calls for investigation from Congress and the White House. 2 major investigations commenced. The Senate created the Church Committee, named after its chairman, Frank Church, to investigate intelligence agency abuses. Simultaneously, President Ford established the Rockefeller Commission to look into illegal domestic activities by the CIA. Both investigations uncovered disturbing details about MKUltra and related programs. But there was a problem. In 1973, 2 years before the story broke, CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered most MKUltra records destroyed. He later claimed this was routine procedure for closing out old programs, but the timing suggests he was covering the CIA's tracks. Thousands of documents were shredded or burned, eliminating much of the evidence of what had actually happened. Only through luck did investigators find anything at all. In 1977, through careful archive searches, they discovered 7 boxes of financial records that had somehow escaped destruction. These boxes contained approvals for funding, vouchers, and accounting documents that weren't particularly informative about the nature of the experiments, but did establish the scope of the program and some of the institutions involved. The Senate hearings proved explosive. For the first time, Americans heard testimony about the CIA dosing unwitting citizens with LSD, conducting experiments in brothels, funding sensory deprivation research that bordered on torture. Senator Ted Kennedy, who participated in the hearings, called for full disclosure. The best way to put this period behind us, obviously, is to have the full information. CIA Director Stansfield Turner had the uncomfortable task of testifying about programs initiated long before his tenure. He acknowledged that MKUltra had involved experimenting on both unwitting and witting subjects, that at least 1 person had died as a result of the experiments, and that the destruction of records meant they might never know the full extent of what had been done. The testimony revealed a disturbing pattern. The experiments had targeted the most vulnerable members of society: prisoners who couldn't refuse, mental patients who couldn't consent, drug addicts who could be coerced with promises of their next fix. college students were sometimes told they were participating in one kind of study while actually being subjected to something else entirely. The concept of informed consent, supposedly sacred in medical ethics, had been thoroughly violated. The Church Committee hearings also revealed Project Stargate's existence, though details remained classified. Americans learned that their government had spent years trying to develop psychic spies, conducting research that most scientists considered impossible. The revelation added an element of absurdity to the horror, making the entire intelligence apparatus seem simultaneously sinister and ridiculous. Media coverage of the revelations was extensive. Newspapers ran front-page stories about CIA mind control experiments. Television news programs featured interviews with victims. Magazine articles explored the ethical and legal implications. But there was also a strange resistance to fully grappling with what had happened. Many Americans struggled to believe that respected institutions, their own government, could have done such things. Surely the stories were exaggerated, sensationalized by media hostile to the intelligence community. Surely there were good reasons, national security justifications that made it all necessary and reasonable. This cognitive dissonance, the difficulty of accepting that your country's government had engaged in torture and unethical experimentation on its own citizens, led many to minimize or rationalize what the investigations had revealed. The legal and political consequences of these revelations were surprisingly limited. No one was prosecuted for the experiments. No CIA officials faced criminal charges for dosing unwitting Americans with LSD or conducting brutal psychological experiments. The prevailing view was that the perpetrators had been operating in a different era, when national security fears justified extreme measures. Some victims did receive compensation. In 1988, a group of patients from the Montreal experiments successfully sued the CIA and received settlements of $67,000 each. In 1992, the Canadian government provided additional compensation of $100,000 to 77 verified victims of Cameron's experiments. But many victims never came forward, either because they were dead, because they were too damaged to navigate the legal process, or because they were ashamed of what had happened to them. The reforms that followed the revelations were more procedural than substantive. Congress passed laws requiring intelligence agencies to notify appropriate committees before conducting certain types of operations. Oversight was strengthened, at least on paper. Guidelines were established for human subject research. But the fundamental power of intelligence agencies to conduct secret operations remained largely intact. In 1976, President Ford issued an executive order prohibiting experimentation with drugs on human subjects without informed consent. The order seemed to close the book on programs like MKUltra, ensuring such abuses could never happen again. But executive orders can be modified or overridden by future presidents. And the order had loopholes and exceptions that intelligence agencies could potentially exploit. Perhaps most troubling was the incomplete nature of the revelations. Because most records had been destroyed, investigators could only scratch the surface of what MKUltra had actually entailed. How many people were experimented on? Thousands, certainly, but the exact number remains unknown. How many institutions were involved? More than 80, but the complete list was never fully established. How many people died or were permanently damaged? The answer will never be known with certainty. This incomplete accounting means that somewhere out there, people carry scars from experiments they might not even remember or understand. Someone who suffered a psychotic break in the 1960s might never know it was triggered by CIA-supplied LSD they were dosed with unknowingly. Someone institutionalized for psychiatric problems might never realize they were deliberately driven to that state by Cameron's brutal experiments. the true human cost remains incalculable. The revelations also had limited impact on the actual practice of intelligence gathering and interrogation. The specific techniques explored in MKUltra might have been abandoned, but the underlying philosophy that extreme measures were justified by national security imperatives persisted. The sensory deprivation research conducted at McGill found its way into interrogation manuals. The psychological manipulation tactics pioneered during this era continued to influence how intelligence agencies approached their work. Looking back, the mid-1970s represented a brief window when the American public was willing to seriously confront intelligence agency abuses. The combination of Watergate, the Vietnam War's aftermath, and the general disillusionment with government authority created space for genuine accountability. But that window closed relatively quickly. By the 1980s, with a new administration emphasizing the Soviet threat and championing intelligence agencies, the appetite for investigating past abuses diminished. Today, the revelations about MKUltra and related programs exist in a strange cultural space. Most people have heard something about CIA mind control experiments and LSD, but the details remain vague. The story has been absorbed into popular culture, referenced in movies and television shows, sometimes treated almost as an entertaining conspiracy theory rather than documented historical fact. This cultural amnesia serves to obscure just how serious these abuses were and how little has been done to ensure they never happen again. Legacy and modern echoes. The immediate programs may have ended decades ago, but their influence continues to shape intelligence practices, interrogation techniques, and the relationship between government secrecy and public accountability. The past, it turns out, isn't even past when it comes to these dark experiments. The most direct legacy appears in interrogation methods used by American military and intelligence agencies in more recent conflicts. The techniques pioneered and refined during the Cold War era didn't disappear. They evolved and found new applications. The Q-Bark Interrogation Manual, which drew heavily on sensory deprivation research from McGill and elsewhere, was updated in the 1980s as the Human Resource Exploitation Manual. This newer version was used to train intelligence personnel in Honduras and other countries, according to investigations by journalists and human rights organizations. When the United States launched its so-called War on Terror after September 11, 2001, some of these techniques resurfaced. Detainees at Guantanamo Bay, at CIA black sites around the world, and at facilities like Abu Ghraib in Iraq were subjected to methods including sensory deprivation, stress positions, temperature manipulation, sleep deprivation, and psychological manipulation. These were presented as enhanced interrogation techniques, a term critics argued was designed to obscure their nature. The famous image from Abu Ghraib, showing a hooded prisoner standing on a box with wires attached to his hands, has been interpreted by some historians and researchers as emblematic of decades of American research into psychological interrogation techniques. The hood creates sensory deprivation, drawing on research from the 1950s. The stress position, arms extended for long periods, reflects principles documented in interrogation manuals about the psychological impact of self-imposed discomfort. Defenders of these techniques argued they weren't torture because they left no permanent physical damage. This echoed the no-touch torture paradigm developed during the MKUltra era. The research had shown that psychological torment could be devastating without leaving visible marks, which some argue made such techniques appear more defensible to policymakers. Mental health professionals and human rights advocates have documented severe psychological effects from prolonged sensory deprivation, weeks of sleep deprivation, and the uncertainty created by these techniques. Post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and cognitive impairment have all been observed in individuals subjected to these methods. Historian Alfred McCoy and other researchers have traced connections from Donald Hebb's experiments at McGill to interrogation manuals used decades later. The research conducted in the name of understanding Cold War brainwashing appears to have influenced American interrogation practices, though the extent and directness of this influence continues to be debated by scholars. This continuity raises uncomfortable questions about whether anything really changed after the Church Committee revelations. Yes, the specific programs were terminated. Yes, there was public outrage and promises of reform. But the institutional knowledge remained. The techniques were simply relabeled and the justifications updated for a new era. The Project Stargate legacy is more ambiguous. Remote viewing never became an operational intelligence tool, and most scientists remain skeptical of its validity. But the program demonstrated the intelligence community's willingness to pursue unconventional approaches, to fund research that mainstream science rejected. This willingness persists today in various programs exploring cutting-edge neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and other fields that might offer intelligence advantages. More broadly, MKUltra and related programs established a template for how government agencies could conduct secret research on American soil while maintaining plausible deniability. Fund research through front organizations. Compartmentalize information so that participants don't understand the full picture. Classify everything at the highest levels. Destroy records if exposure seems likely. This playbook didn't disappear in the 1970s. The pharmaceutical industry's relationship with government research also has roots in this era. The partnerships formed between CIA-funded researchers and drug companies. The willingness of pharmaceutical companies to provide experimental compounds without asking too many questions about how they'd be used. These patterns established during the Cold War continue to influence how drugs are developed and tested today. Medical ethics reforms implemented after the MKUltra revelations, including stronger requirements for informed consent and institutional review boards overseeing human subject research, represent genuine progress. But these safeguards apply primarily to research conducted openly through recognized institutions. Secret government programs, by definition, operate outside normal oversight structures. What's to stop intelligence agencies from conducting similar research today? Simply being more careful about compartmentalization and record keeping? This question isn't merely hypothetical. In 2014, the Office of Naval Research launched a multi-million-dollar program to explore premonition and intuition among sailors and Marines. The research was presented as investigating decision-making under uncertainty, but it echoed Project Stargate's interest in whether some people possess heightened ability to sense danger before it manifests. Old interests die hard. The cultural legacy of these programs is equally significant. MKUltra has become a staple of conspiracy theories, fictional treatments, and pop culture references. Television shows feature secret government experiments. Movies depict CIA, mind control programs. Video games use MKUltra as backstory. This cultural presence serves two contradictory functions. On one hand, it keeps the history alive, ensuring that new generations learn about these abuses. Popular culture can communicate the horror and absurdity of these programs in ways that dry historical accounts sometimes fail to capture. The fictional Hawkins Laboratory resonates with audiences precisely because everyone knows, at some level, that real government laboratories conducted experiments nearly as disturbing. On the other hand, cultural saturation can trivialize the reality. When CIA mind control experiments become plot devices in thrillers and video games, when they're lumped together with UFO conspiracies and other fringe theories. The actual documented history risks being dismissed as just another conspiracy tale. The entertainment value can obscure the real suffering of real victims. For the victims and their families, the legacy is deeply personal and ongoing. The Montreal experiments left multi-generational trauma. Children of Cameron's patients grew up with parents who couldn't remember them, who had to relearn basic life skills, who were shells of their former selves. These children often developed their own psychological problems as a result. The trauma passed from one generation to the next. Many victims never received compensation or acknowledgement. They died before the programs became public, or they were too damaged to come forward, or they fell through the cracks of the limited compensation schemes that were eventually established. Their stories remain untold, their suffering unacknowledged by the governments and institutions that caused it. The question of accountability remains unresolved. No one was prosecuted for these experiments. Sidney Gottlieb retired to his farm and lived quietly until his death in 1999. Donald Ewan Cameron died before the Montreal experiments became widely known. The CIA officials who approved and oversaw these programs faced no legal consequences. This lack of accountability sends a troubling message about the consequences of conducting secret experiments on citizens when done under official authorization. Some argue that the people involved were products of their time, that Cold War fears justified extreme measures, that they genuinely believed they were protecting national security. But this argument requires ignoring the fact that even at the time, what they were doing violated established ethical principles. The Nuremberg Code existed. Professional ethics existed. They simply chose to ignore these constraints because they believed the ends justified the means. The ultimate legacy of these programs lies in the questions they raise about the balance between national security and individual rights, between government secrecy and public accountability. These questions remain unresolved. Every few years, new revelations emerge about surveillance programs, about drone strike procedures, about detention and interrogation practices that push or cross ethical boundaries. The specific abuses change, but the underlying tension persists. How much power should intelligence agencies have to operate in secret, conducting activities the public doesn't know about and Congress barely oversees? At what point does national security become a blanket justification for unconscionable acts? Who decides when the threat is serious enough to justify abandoning normal ethical constraints? These questions haunted the Cold War era, and they haunt us still. The MKUltra revelations didn't definitively answer these questions. They temporarily shifted the balance toward accountability and oversight, but that shift proved impermanent. Within a generation, many of the same techniques were being used again, justified by a different threat, but drawing on the same research and rationalized with similar arguments about necessity and security. Until there's genuine accountability, until intelligence agencies operate with meaningful oversight, until government secrecy is genuinely balanced against democratic transparency, the lessons of MKUltra remain unlearned. The programs may have ended, but the mindset that created them persists. And that mindset, more than any specific technique or drug, represents the true danger these experiments revealed. Closing thoughts, remembering and learning. As we reach the end of this journey through one of the darkest chapters in American government history, it's worth pausing to consider what these stories mean for us today. The experiments conducted under Project MKUltra, the Montreal studies, Project Stargate, and related programs weren't aberrations carried out by rogue agents. They were systematic, officially sanctioned, extensively funded operations that received approval at the highest levels of government. Thousands of people were experimented on without their knowledge or consent. Lives were destroyed. Families were shattered. People lost their memories, their identities, their sanity. Some died, all in pursuit of mind control capabilities that never worked and could never work as intended. The fictional Hawkins National Laboratory serves as a powerful metaphor for these real programs. The image of children subjected to psychological experimentation, of young people developing abilities through traumatic procedures, of a government facility operating without oversight or accountability resonates because it taps into this real history. The fiction is unsettling precisely because it's rooted in documented fact. But unlike the fiction, where protagonists eventually expose the truth and shut down the laboratory, the real story offers no such clear resolution. The programs were revealed not through heroic whistleblowers, but through accidental document discoveries and investigations sparked by broader political scandals. The truth emerged incomplete, with most records destroyed, and the consequences for those responsible were minimal to non-existent. This lack of resolution should trouble us. It means the mechanisms that allowed these abuses could potentially allow similar abuses in the future. It means the knowledge gained through unethical means remains in institutional memory, available to be deployed whenever authorities decide the threat is serious enough to justify extreme measures. The victims of these experiments deserve to be remembered not as statistics or footnotes, but as human beings who suffered real harm. Linda MacDonald, who entered treatment for postpartum depression and emerged unable to recognise her own children. The 7 men in Lexington who received LSD for 77 consecutive days. Whitey Bulger, who believed he was helping cure schizophrenia, while actually being used as a guinea pig for mind control experiments. Frank Olson, who died in a fall from a hotel window 10 days after being unwittingly dosed with LSD. These stories matter because they remind us that government power, however well-intentioned its stated purposes, can be wielded against the most vulnerable members of society. They remind us that secrecy enables abuse. They remind us that national security can become a catch-all justification for unconscionable acts. They remind us that medical and scientific credentials don't guarantee ethical behaviour. The lessons extend beyond intelligence agencies. The willingness of researchers at prestigious universities to conduct experiments on unwitting subjects. The pharmaceutical companies that provided drugs without asking too many questions about their use. The medical professionals who participated in brutal procedures while claiming therapeutic intent. All of these implicate broader systems and institutions beyond just the CIA. We must also reckon with the fact that much of this research was conducted on society's most vulnerable: prisoners, mental patients, drug addicts, the poor, racial minorities. This wasn't accidental. These populations were chosen precisely because they had limited ability to resist or seek recourse. The experiments reveal not just governmental overreach, but deeper patterns of exploitation that persist in various forms today. As we navigate our current era of rapid technological advancement, these stories take on renewed relevance. New capabilities in neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology create new possibilities for both benefit and abuse. The techniques available to those who would manipulate human consciousness or behaviour are far more sophisticated than LSD and sensory deprivation. The potential for misuse is correspondingly greater. The question facing us now is whether we've learned anything from this history. Will we demand genuine oversight and accountability from intelligence agencies? Will we insist on transparency, even when it's uncomfortable? Will we stand up for the rights of the vulnerable, recognizing that their rights are ultimately everyone's rights? Or will we allow fear, whether of terrorism or some other threat, to justify a new generation of secret programs and unethical experiments? These aren't rhetorical questions. They require active engagement from an informed citizenry. That's why telling these stories matters. That's why we must resist the cultural tendency to treat this history as mere conspiracy theory or entertainment fodder. Real people suffered real harm. Real governmental agencies conducted real experiments that violated fundamental ethical principles. And the systems that enabled those abuses have never been fully dismantled. If you've made it this far on this journey through the shadows of Cold War experimentation, I hope you'll take these stories with you. Share them, discuss them. Use them to inform your thinking about government power and individual rights. Question official reassurances about classified programs. Demand accountability when abuses are revealed. Remember the victims and honour their suffering by working to ensure such experiments never happen again. The laboratory doors at facilities like the Allen Memorial Institute have long since closed. The specific programs discussed here are history. But the struggle between security and liberty, between governmental power and individual rights, between secrecy and accountability continues. Every generation must decide where to draw the lines. Our choices will determine whether the dark history we've explored remains in the past or serves as prologue to future abuses. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the real-world horrors that inspired fictional nightmares. If you found this exploration valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are more stories to tell, more hidden histories to uncover, more lessons from the past that remain urgently relevant to our present. The truth, no matter how disturbing, deserves to be known and remembered. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop asking questions about what's happening behind closed doors in the name of your security. The cost of ignorance, as the victims of these experiments learned, can be devastating. The price of vigilance is eternal, but the alternative is far worse. Sleep well if you can, knowing that while Hawkins Laboratory may be fiction, the horrors that inspired it were all too real.